So today I'm going to walk you through the steps that I took in turning this beautiful piece of burled maple into our family's coffee table in our living room. I'm going to walk you through the steps on how I figured out the sizing that I needed, how I picked out the wood, and then all the steps in making it. Let's get started. So I started off with a tape measure in my living room just to get the sizing that I wanted the coffee table to fit. That way I can take that with me and know how much wood I needed to buy. And I'm heading off to Home Depot. I had to pick up some melamine for the form. I only needed a couple feet of melamine, but they only sell it in 4 feet by 8 feet sheets, so I just picked up a whole sheet and I can use it on another project. And I cut down the melamine to make a form for my coffee table, and I'll be making this an inch wider and an inch longer than I want the coffee table to actually be, just so I have a little extra room to work with. I like to use melamine for the form because it has a shiny coat on it that helps repel the epoxy. So I find that if I use a mold release, it comes off pretty easily. Now I built this jig to work with my skill saw. A track saw would definitely be a better choice, but I don't have one, and this works for me. And I used a $15 skill saw that I got at a garage sale. Worked just fine for what I needed to do. And I'm cutting the sides down, and these sides I'm making 2 inches tall. I like to make them taller than the actual coffee table will be, just so if the pour does go up and over the project, I don't want it to go over the sides of the form. And I'm using the track just to cut the longer edges. It made it easier than the table saw because I didn't have cutoffs that would work for me to put through the table saw. To attach the edges, I used a nail punch, and I'm actually just using it on the sides just to get through that shiny melamine. I find that if I don't give it a bit of a hole through it, the screw tends to wander or won't go in at all. So this is the trick that I've been using. Now you want to make sure that your boards are as tight to the edge as possible, because any gap that you leave, the epoxy will definitely run out of. And epoxy isn't cheap, so you definitely don't want to lose any of it. Especially since I'm going to be doing my epoxy pour inside since it's cold. I definitely don't want epoxy all over the family room floor. I'm using common drywall screws to attach these. Here I am using scrap wood to build a template inside this form. So I want it to measure the exact inside dimensions of the form, so I know exactly the sizing that I need. And I'm assembling it with brad nails and just making sure to get the corners square. So this template essentially cost me nothing because it was made out of scrap wood, and it took me about, 4 minutes, 5 minutes to put together. And this came in so handy when buying the wood. When you're there and you're dealing with these huge slabs of wood, sometimes the piece that you need seems too small just in there. So it was nice to have this. I could go around, I could see how different pieces of wood would look, how I would do the layout to make it look right. So I'm also going to use this to play with this piece of wood and get a good idea for what I want my table to look like. So while I was at the lumber yard, I played around with it for probably about 15 minutes, looking at all the different design ideas. With this piece, it's something that I can do a lot of different design ideas with. So let me lay it out and I'll show you the next step. So I really thought the layout through for a few days here because I only get one shot to cut this piece of wood, and this wood wasn't cheap. It cost me $300. So I really wanted to do it right. I needed to make sure that the layout that I chose would fill the space correctly, and the pieces that were left over would also fit in nicely with the design as well. So you definitely want to take the time just to make sure that you're maximizing your piece of wood that you buy and creating something that you're really going to want to look at. All right, I only get one shot at this. Made up my mind, so hopefully this works. I'm using the jig again with the skill saw here. And this being a pretty thick cut through the maple, I decided to cut it just in sections. And we have one problem. The skill saw blade wouldn't go quite low enough. So I'm just getting a handsaw to do the rest of the work. So the layout I decided to go with is to cut off the ends, and then I'll be cutting it down the middle and turning the live edge in and using the cutoffs to plug the inlets. And here I am cutting off the second piece, preparing to cut it down the center. And you really appreciate the power tools that you have when you have to do something by hand. When lining up the jig for cutting the middle of the table, I had a few knots to consider here, so I really had to think about where I wanted to position it, just so that it would look right for the table. And now with the wood cut, I'm just setting it into the form so that I can see how it looks. So at this point, I have my wood cut and I have them in the form. However, I have decided that this is going to be way too much epoxy for me to afford. So I did some more measurements, and I'm actually going to just cut a little bit off of this form, and I'm going to bring it in just a little bit here. So I will take off about 3 to 4 inches off of this, making it still the same length, but just not quite as wide. And then I'll use these scrap pieces that I have left over, and I will cut them to fit right in either of the edges. That way I won't be using as much epoxy, which won't cost as much, but it'll still have a good shape. The epoxy that I like to use runs around $200 for 6 liters. And I have budgeted about $300 in epoxy for this project. So I was hoping to use 7.5 liters, not much more than that. So by taking off these 3 to 4 inches off of the edge, it's going to make my project move back into the budget that I was hoping for. So when I went into this project, I was thinking that the wood would be the most expensive part. And in actuality, what I found out is that the epoxy actually ends up being as much or more expensive than the wood. So for my next project, I will definitely focus on purchasing a little bit of a larger piece of wood, because a little more wood would be less expensive than using more epoxy. It also depends on what kind of wood you're using as well. I fell in love with this burled maple, so I did pay a premium for it. Depending on what wood you're using, it may be a lot cheaper than the epoxy. Or if you choose to go with something very exotic, then you may be paying more for your wood, and in that case, maybe the epoxy would be cheaper. And now to cut these in pieces that will fit in the inlets. I made sure to cut it so that the live edge was facing in, and they'll really add a lot of detail to the coffee table. At this point, I'm just cleaning up the wood. I'm trying to get rid of all of the loose bark and also remove all of the soft wood from it. I just want to make sure that I'm exposing the natural good wood in there, and I don't want any of the soft spots, just because that doesn't finish well in the end. I use the orbital sander just to really sand down that live edge, make sure I'm getting rid of all of the dirt. I want to make sure that that epoxy really adheres to the wood well. So at this point, I'll be moving inside to do my epoxy pour. Now I'm applying shellac along the top and the bottom of these boards. Since I will be using a black epoxy and my wood is so light, I just don't want to risk having it soak into this maple and dye it black. Now it's important to make sure that your form is level. I'm using just some slight puzzle pieces you can see here just to make sure that I bring up the edge that was a little bit lower. So with epoxy, you want to make sure to have no gaps in your form, because if you have the smallest gap, the epoxy will all leak out of it. So I'm using caulking on the inside of the form just to make sure that everything is sealed up tight. So in my past projects, I've used Vaseline for a mold release, and this time I got the spray mold release, which is the actual item you should be using. And so far, this is a lot easier to apply than the Vaseline. And I'm setting my pieces in for the final time. And I'm using the mold release on some scraps that I have. This provides me an area to clamp to so I can hold the wood down. This prevents the wood from floating up in the epoxy. And here I am doing an estimate, figuring out how much epoxy I'm going to need. I'm using 2-to-1 Epoxy, and with this product, they claim to not have bubbles. I've had good luck with it in the past. I don't heat treat afterwards, and I don't seem to get the bubbles that other people get. So right now, this is what I use. It works for me. It takes a while to learn an epoxy's strengths and weaknesses and how to work with it, so I just stick with what I know. Now I'm using a black dye, and unfortunately the dropper on mine isn't working, and so I got my black a little bit darker than I would have preferred. I was hoping to have it a little more translucent so I could see through to the wood underneath. And now comes the most fun part. You spend days prepping your wood, prepping your form to get to this part, just to make sure that you have a successful pour. And the pour takes a matter of minutes. But it's the most enjoyable part, seeing that epoxy pour in and you can see essentially what your project is going to look like. I had the opportunity to go visit Cam from Blacktail Studios. If you haven't checked out his live edge work already, you definitely should. He does great, amazing things, and a lot of the tips and tricks that you see me use in this video, I actually learned from him. I use a brush to paint on the epoxy on the live edge, just to make sure all the gaps and holes are filled with epoxy and no bubbles are created. And it's time to remove the form. So the epoxy needs to cure for 72 hours. I had other things that I was working on, so I let this project sit for a week drying. Now you can see that the epoxy seemed to pool down at the one end a little more than the other. I'm not sure if the wood was maybe not quite as thick on that edge or what happened there. And removing the form, I can tell that the mold release was definitely a good choice. You can see that it comes right off. These pieces almost could be used again. I've never used a form again because I don't make the same project twice. But if you plan to build the same coffee table size over and over again, maybe this is something that you could do. And you can see that there was a little bubble that formed underneath the wood. This is the bottom, so this won't be a big deal. And I'm headed back out to the shop to finish this up. Now, since the epoxy was a little thicker on that one side, the melamine really stuck to it. I'm removing all of the excess pieces before taking it through the drum sander. I used the skill saw and just trued up the edges, making sure everything's square. Now, originally when I was going to do this project, I thought I would be making a router sled. However, I decided to use my friend's drum sander instead. The drum sander worked well. However, it did leave some marks on the overhang, and for a project that was larger than this especially, I would need to make a router sled. Now you can see the bubbles that were left here because I put that block to hold the piece of wood down. So I definitely need to do something different about that in the future. I spent days sanding this project, so that's something that you really want to consider when taking on a big project. I sanded down the table to 150 grit, just until it was smooth. I used CA glue and accelerator to fill all of the small holes. Then I went over everything with 150 grit again. And from here I continued to work up the grits, up to 600 grit sandpaper, making sure to sand out the lines from the previous grit. To knock down the edges, I used a 1/4 inch round over bit. I hand sanded the routered edges just so that it kept that curve. For my past epoxy projects, I was making serving trays, so I used a cutting board finisher. So for this coffee table, since it was going to be in a high traffic area, I wanted something that would give it a lot more of a durable finish. So I chose to go with shellac since I thought it would give that hard coating. However, this was a complete failure for me. It caused a bunch of streaking on the wood, and it cost me at least 2 days of work extra. So I would not recommend shellac at all when finishing an epoxy project. So you can see that after the shellac dried, it left streaks all over the table that I could not buff out. I ended up having to resand completely over again, going down to 80 grit to get that out. And I needed to find a new product to use to finish the tabletop. After resanding through all of my grits up to 600 grit once again, I had someone recommend Osmo to me, so I decided to give it a try. It's a hard wax finish that's meant for coffee tables, dining room tables, and wood flooring. This was easy to apply, easy to work with, and so far it's been great. As you can see, this product was very low odor, so I actually even brought this into my house. A lot of people suggest applying Osmo with a credit card, so I did just that. I used my credit card to go on Amazon and buy myself a plastic applicator. It worked great to spread this. Now, the nice thing about this product is you use just a very small, thin amount, so it will last you a long time. I used a buffing pad to buff the Osmo into the coffee table. It would be nice to use an electric buffer. However, I didn't have one, so I just did it by hand and it worked great. I placed the legs where I wanted them on the table, and then I pre-marked with a drill bit just so I knew exactly where I wanted the threaded insert to go. I used a punch just to mark each of those holes, so when I put the drill bit in, it wouldn't wander on me. I used painter's tape for a visual depth stop. So rather than make my own custom legs, since I had enough going with making this custom top, I decided to order from a local company that custom built them to the exact height and width that I wanted them and had them delivered within 4 weeks. It was well worth it, cost a couple $100. They were very minimalistic and the exact style that I was looking for the coffee table. I used a dab of glue when applying the threaded inserts in. This will prevent them from backing out, and also added a little bit of lubricant when screwing them in. I don't know if this is necessary, but I've heard it's a good thing to do. Here I am bolting the legs onto the table, and the nice thing about using the threaded inserts are that I can take this table apart as many times as I want and it won't strip out the holes. So it makes it easier for transporting or moving the table at any time. So this project has been a long time coming, and I am just so excited with how it turned out. When I got to see what this burled maple actually looked like, it's more amazing than I even imagined it could be. The swirl patterns in it, everything about it just almost glows. It looks like flowing water just in the actual wood. And the black epoxy just helps to almost show off the wood, I guess. I just really like how it looks. This was somewhat of an expensive build compared to a lot of the projects that are on my channel, coming in at around $800. However, if you compare to high-end places like Pottery Barn or Restoration Hardware that are also going to give you a good quality table, you'll find that those tables would be well over $1,000. So I really like that with this I got solid wood, I got durable, strong legs, and this table will really last my family for a long time. When I started this journey about a year ago, I thought that doing something like this would be just so hard and so tough to do. I didn't even think it was something possible that I could do. And now that I realize that honestly, it was not that difficult, I'm just so excited to make more projects and do more with this. So thank you for watching, and if you like this video, please subscribe and stay tuned for more videos.